The setting sun painted the town of Willow Creek in hues of copper and gold as Samuel Hart rode down the main street, his weary horse kicking up dust with each plodding step. The year was 1876, and like many drifters in the post-war West, Samuel was a man with little to his name but the clothes on his back and the memories that haunted his dreams. Samuel patted his horse's neck, feeling the animal's bones beneath his palm. "Just a little further, Kingston. We'll get you fed soon enough." The sorrel gelding had carried him faithfully across 3 states, and Samuel wouldn't see him starve, not after everything they'd been through together. The town appeared modest, but established a single main street lined with the usual amenities. A general store, saloon, blacksmith, and at the far end, a white wooden church whose steeple reached toward the darkening sky. Samuel's attention was focused on finding the livery stable, where he hoped to secure feed for Kingston and perhaps negotiate a few days' work to replenish his dwindling funds. That's when he heard a sound that didn't belong among the typical evening noises of a frontier town. A woman's desperate plea carried on the evening breeze. Samuel reined Kingston to a halt, cocking his head to listen. The cries were coming from the direction of the church. Despite his exhaustion and the pressing need to care for his horse, Samuel couldn't ignore the sound. Something in the woman's voice, raw fear mingled with determination, pulled at him. He guided Kingston toward the church, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the pistol at his hip. As the white clapboard building came fully into view, Samuel saw her, a young woman in a plain dress, clutching a small bundle to her chest as she huddled on the church steps. Her honey-brown hair had mostly escaped its pins, falling around a face marked by exhaustion and terror. "Please," she was saying to the man standing before her, a well-dressed fellow with a neatly trimmed beard and hard eyes. "Please, just let us be. I won't trouble you again." "You made a commitment, Faith," the man replied, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Your place is at home, not running off with my child in the middle of the night like some common thief." Samuel dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. His movement caught the attention of both figures on the church steps. The woman Faith looked at him with a mixture of hope and wariness. The man's expression hardened further. "Evening," Samuel said, tipping his hat slightly. "Couldn't help but overhear. Seems the lady doesn't want to go with you." "This is none of your concern, stranger," the man replied, his hand moving to rest on an expensive-looking pistol holstered at his side. "This is a family matter between me and my wife." Samuel noticed the bruises on Faith's wrist when she shifted the bundle of baby he realized in her arms. Fresh anger stirred in his chest. "I'm just passing through," Samuel said carefully, taking a step closer. "Looking for feed for my horse, but I have a policy about not riding past a woman in distress." Faith's eyes locked with his, and in that moment, something passed between them, a silent understanding, a plea for help that Samuel couldn't ignore. "I can't go back," Faith said, her voice steadier now. "Not with my son. Not anymore, Gerald." The man named Gerald scoffed. "You have nowhere to go, Faith. No money, no family. What kind of mother takes a child into homelessness, the kind trying to keep him safe?" Samuel found himself saying. Gerald's eyes narrowed. "Who the hell are you to interfere?" Samuel Hart. He took another step forward, purposeful now. "And I believe the lady has made her choice clear." Gerald's hand tightened on his gun. "This is the last time I'll tell you, Hart. Walk away. My wife is coming home where she belongs." The church door opened behind Faith, and an older man in clerical attire appeared. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his gaze moving between the 3 adults. "Pastor Brown," Faith said, relief evident in her voice. "Please, I came seeking sanctuary." The pastor assessed the situation quickly. "Mr. Wallace, I believe I mentioned earlier that Faith has requested time to consider her situation. The church offers that space to those in need. She's been considering for 2 days now," Gerald Wallace spat. "My patience is at an end." Samuel stepped up beside Faith, positioning himself between her and Gerald. "The church has offered sanctuary. I suggest you respect that, Mr. Wallace." For a tense moment, Samuel thought Gerald might draw his weapon. Instead, the man's lips curled into a cold smile. "Very well. The church's protection won't last forever, Faith. Neither will the charity of strangers." His eyes flicked to Samuel. "You've made a poor choice of allies, my dear." Gerald turned and walked away, his posture rigid with anger. Samuel watched him go, noting the expensive boots, the fine coat, the way other townspeople nodded deferentially as he passed. "He's an important man in town," Pastor Brown said quietly, as if reading Samuel's thoughts. "Important men can do terrible things," Samuel replied, turning to Faith. "Are you all right, madam?" She nodded, though her hands trembled as she adjusted the blanket around her sleeping baby. "Thank you, you didn't have to step in," Samuel shrugged. "Some things a man can't ride past." Pastor Brown cleared his throat. "Faith has been staying in our small back room, but I fear Mr. Wallace won't give up so easily. He has considerable influence in Willow Creek." Faith looked up at Samuel, her green eyes tired but determined. "You mentioned you were looking for feed, for your horse." Samuel nodded, suddenly remembering Kingston waiting patiently behind him. "Yes, madam. My gelding and I have traveled far, and he's in need of a good meal and rest." "The livery is owned by Gerald's cousin," Faith said softly. "Once he learns you interfered, you may find yourself unwelcome there." Samuel sighed, running a hand through his dust-covered brown hair. "That complicates things." "I can offer a solution," Faith said, standing a bit straighter. "Before I married Gerald, I worked at the Miller farm just outside town. They're good people. They might provide feed for your horse and perhaps work for you, and they owe me no loyalty to Gerald." Samuel studied her for a moment. There was something about this woman, a quiet strength beneath the fear that compelled him. "That's kind of you, but what about you and your little one?" Faith glanced down at her son. "I don't know yet. I can't stay at the church forever, and Gerald won't stop looking for us in Willow Creek." An idea formed in Samuel's mind, perhaps reckless, certainly unexpected, but somehow it felt right. "I'm heading north, eventually to Montana Territory. It's a long journey, but if you need to get away from here." Pastor Brown raised his eyebrows. "Mr. Hart, you've only just met Faith. Such an offer is merely practical," Samuel finished. "I'm offering safe passage, not making improper suggestions. I was raised better than that." Faith's expression was unreadable for a moment, then she nodded slowly. "Let me think on it. In the meantime, I can write you a note for the Millers. They live about 2 miles north of town." As Faith went inside with the pastor to write the note, Samuel returned to Kingston, stroking the horse's muzzle thoughtfully. He hadn't planned on becoming entangled in a local dispute, especially one involving a man of influence. Samuel had learned the hard way that powerful men could make life difficult, even dangerous. Yet there was something about Faith's quiet dignity, the protective way she held her child, that resonated with him. Samuel had spent the years since the war drifting, working ranch jobs, keeping to himself. He wasn't looking for complications, but sometimes, he reflected, a man didn't choose his path. Sometimes the path chose him. Faith returned with a folded piece of paper. "The Millers are good people. Tell them I sent you." Samuel accepted the note, careful not to touch her fingers. "Thank you." "What about you and the little one?" Faith glanced back at the church. "We're safe enough for tonight. Pastor Brown has been kind." "I'll return tomorrow," Samuel found himself saying, "to check on you if that's all right." Faith's smile was small but genuine. "I'd appreciate that, Mr. Hart." "Samuel," he corrected. "Samuel," she repeated softly. "I'm Faith Wallace, though I wish I could shed that name as easily as I fled his house." The baby in her arms stirred, making tiny noises. Faith gently rocked him. "And who's this fellow?" Samuel asked, nodding toward the bundle. "This is James," Faith said, her voice softening. "He's 5 months old." Samuel tipped his hat. "Pleased to meet you both. I'll be back tomorrow after I see to Kingston here and find a place to lay my head." As Samuel mounted his horse and turned toward the road leading out of town, he couldn't help glancing back. Faith stood watching him, her silhouette framed against the church door, her baby held close against the gathering darkness. The Miller farm was exactly where Faith had said it would be, a modest spread with fields of wheat and corn, a small orchard, and a barn that had seen better days but was well maintained. An older couple welcomed Samuel cautiously until he presented Faith's note, at which point their demeanor changed completely. "Faith sent you?" Martha Miller asked, her weathered face lighting up. "How is she?" "We heard rumors she'd left that awful man, but in a town like Willow Creek, gossip is often more fiction than fact. She's at the church with her baby, Samuel explained, accepting the cup of coffee Martha offered. Seems she's in a difficult situation. John Miller, a tall man with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands, nodded gravely. Gerald Wallace is not a man who likes to lose what he considers his property, and in his mind, Faith and that baby are exactly that property. She worked for you, Samuel asked. Faith Calloway was our help for nearly 3 years, Martha said, her voice warm with affection. Smartest young woman I've ever known, could keep accounts better than any bank clerk and worked hard besides. We were heartbroken when Wallace set his sights on her. John snorted. Told her not to marry him. Something wasn't right about that man for all his fine clothes and fancy talk. Faith mentioned I might find work here, Samuel said. My funds are low, and now it seems I've made myself unwelcome at the livery in town. John and Martha exchanged glances. We could use an extra hand, John admitted. Got a field needs clearing, and I'm not as young as I once was. Can you handle farm work? Samuel nodded. I've done my share. Raised on a farm in Pennsylvania before the war, worked ranch jobs since. You fought? John asked. Union cavalry, Samuel replied simply, not wanting to elaborate. Those memories were best left undisturbed. John seemed to understand. Well, we can offer you the small cabin out back. It's basic but sound. $3 a week and meals for the work, plus feed for your horse. It was a fair offer, better than Samuel had expected. I'm grateful, but I should mention I told Faith I'd help her leave town if she decides that's what she wants. I don't intend to stay in Willow Creek long. Martha nodded approvingly. That girl needs to get far away from Gerald Wallace. If you're offering her safe passage, you'll find no argument from us. Samuel was shown to the cabin, a one-room structure with a bed, table, and small stove. It was the most permanent lodging he'd had in months, and Kingston seemed equally pleased with the barn stall and fresh hay. That night, lying on the narrow bed, Samuel found himself thinking of Faith's determined eyes and the small, vulnerable bundle in her arms. He had promised himself after the war that he would avoid other people's troubles. The West was full of opportunities for a man who kept to himself, who didn't form attachments. Yet here he was, already entangled in a stranger's life after less than a day in Willow Creek. Samuel turned onto his side, watching moonlight filter through the cabin's single window. Just safe passage, he reminded himself. Nothing more. But even as he drifted toward sleep, Samuel knew that some promises were easier made than kept. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Samuel rose with the sun, as was his habit, and joined John Miller in the barn. After tending to Kingston and the Millers' 2 workhorses, they set about clearing rocks from a field John hoped to plant come spring. Physical labor had always helped Samuel think, and today was no exception. As he worked alongside the older man, heaving stones onto a cart, his mind kept returning to Faith and her predicament. Wallace has money and connections, John said during a water break, as if reading Samuel's thoughts. His family was one of the first to settle here. They own the bank, have interests in the mines north of here, not the kind of people most folks cross. How did someone like Faith end up married to him? Samuel asked. John wiped his brow. Wallace can be charming when he wants something, and Faith. She had no family, was saving every penny to maybe buy a small place of her own someday. Wallace offered security, respectability, and turned out to be a different man behind closed doors, Samuel guessed. John nodded grimly. Martha suspected as much when Faith stopped visiting. Then when we saw her in town with bruises she tried to hide. He shook his head. We offered help, but by then she was carrying his child and felt trapped. They worked in silence for a while, the rhythmic clink of stones hitting the cart the only sound between them. You're taking a risk helping her, John finally said. Wallace won't forget it. Samuel straightened, stretching his back. I've dealt with men like him before. They're usually cowards at heart. Maybe, John conceded, but cowards with power can be dangerous. Watch yourself in town. By mid-afternoon, Samuel had earned a meal and feed for Kingston. After washing up, he borrowed the miller's wagon to return to Willow Creek, declining John's offer to accompany him. If there's trouble, Samuel said, better if you're not associated with it. Martha packed a basket with food for Faith and the baby. Tell her there's always a place for her here if she needs it. The town seemed quieter than the previous evening as Samuel drove the wagon down the main street. He noticed curious glances from townspeople and a few openly hostile stares. News traveled fast in small communities. Outside the church, Samuel tied the wagon horses to a hitching post and knocked on the door. Pastor Brown answered, his expression tightening when he saw Samuel. "Mr. Hart," he said quietly, "please come in." Inside, the church was cool and dim. Pastor Brown led Samuel to a small office at the back. "Faith is resting with the baby," he explained, closing the door behind them. "There have been developments." Samuel's muscles tensed. "What kind of developments?" "Gerald Wallace visited the mayor this morning." By afternoon, a notice was posted. The pastor passed a piece of paper to Samuel. "This was delivered to me an hour ago." Samuel read the notice, his jaw clenching with each line. It declared Faith mentally unstable and unfit to care for her child, claiming she had fled in a state of hysteria, endangering herself and the Wallace heir. It authorized the town marshal to return both mother and child to Gerald Wallace's custody for their own protection. "This is ridiculous," Samuel said, setting the paper down. "Anyone who speaks with Faith can see she's of sound mind." "Of course she is," Pastor Brown agreed. "But Wallace has convinced the mayor and judge that her behavior is erratic, possibly due to female hysteria or melancholia following the birth. Such diagnoses are difficult to disprove, especially when the accuser is a respected businessman, and the accused is a woman with no family or position." Samuel paced the small office. "When will they come for her?" The marshal mentioned tomorrow morning. "He's giving me time to counsel her into returning voluntarily." Pastor Brown's expression made clear his opinion of this supposed kindness. "She can't stay in Willow Creek," Samuel concluded. "No," a voice said from the doorway. Faith stood there, James sleeping in her arms. She looked more composed than the previous evening, though still weary. "I can't." Samuel turned to face her. "I meant what I said about offering safe passage north." Faith entered the room, her movements careful so as not to wake the baby. "Why would you take such a risk for strangers, Mr. Hart?" Samuel considered the question, surprised to find he didn't have a simple answer. "I've spent years since the war keeping to myself, not getting involved. Maybe it's time I stopped riding past things that need fixing." Faith studied him for a moment, then nodded. "If I accept your help, you should know what you're risking. Gerald won't just let us go. He'll claim I've kidnapped James. He might even accuse you of improper involvement." "Let him," Samuel said. "I know the truth, and so do you." Pastor Brown cleared his throat. "If you're determined to leave, it should be tonight. The marshal won't come before morning, and darkness will provide some cover." "The Millers sent food," Samuel told Faith. "And they offered shelter if needed." Faith shook her head. "I won't bring trouble to their door. Gerald would suspect them immediately." She hesitated. "If we're to leave tonight, I need to gather what few things I have, and James will need milk and clean cloths for the journey." "I can purchase supplies," Samuel offered. "Use this," Pastor Brown said, opening a small box on his desk and removing several dollars. "From the church's charitable fund. I can think of no more appropriate use." Samuel accepted the money with a nod of thanks. "I'll return at nightfall with the wagon. We'll leave from here." As Samuel turned to go, Faith touched his arm lightly. "Thank you, Samuel. I know this isn't your burden to bear." Something in her voice, gratitude mingled with resolve, stirred feelings Samuel had thought long buried. "We all need help sometimes," he said simply. Back in town, Samuel purchased the supplies Faith had requested, keeping his interactions brief. At the general store, he sensed the owner's suspicion, but was treated fairly enough. It wasn't until he was loading the packages into the wagon that he felt someone watching him. Samuel turned to find a man wearing a marshal's badge leaning against a nearby post. "Afternoon," the marshal said, straightening. "You must be Hart. Heard you rode in yesterday." Samuel nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Just passing through, picking up supplies. Seems you've made quite an impression for someone just passing through." The marshal, a stocky man with a graying mustache and watchful eyes, stepped closer. "Got folks talking about how you interfered in a private matter between a man and his wife. If by private matter you mean a frightened woman seeking sanctuary, then yes, I offered assistance." Samuel continued loading the wagon, though his awareness of the marshal's every move remained acute. "Mr. Wallace is concerned about his wife's state of mind, says she hasn't been right since the baby came." The marshal's tone was conversational, but his eyes were sharp. "A husband has rights, you understand, legal rights to his wife and child." Samuel faced the marshal directly. "And does a wife have rights to safety? Does a child have the right to a mother who isn't living in fear?" The marshal's expression hardened. "You're not from around here, so I'll give you some advice. Gerald Wallace has deep roots in this town, deeper than some church steps. Whatever you think you're doing, it won't end well." "I appreciate the advice," Samuel replied evenly. "Will there be anything else, Marshal?" For a tense moment, the two men regarded each other, then the marshal stepped back. "Not today, but I'll be keeping an eye on you, Hart." "Looking forward to it," Samuel said, climbing onto the wagon seat. As he drove back to the Miller farm, Samuel knew the encounter had confirmed his suspicions. There would be no justice for Faith in Willow Creek. Their only option was to leave tonight. Martha Miller helped Samuel pack provisions for the journey: jerky, hardtack, coffee, and other staples that would travel well. John offered a spare blanket and an old but serviceable rifle. "The road north can be dangerous," he said, showing Samuel that the weapon was loaded and in good working order. "Indians are mostly peaceful these days, but there are always bandits and other troubles." Martha pressed a small cloth pouch into Samuel's hand. "Dried herbs for the baby if he gets colicky. Faith will know how to use them." Their kindness touched Samuel. "I'll see they get safely away from here," he promised. John clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You're a good man, Hart, whatever your reasons." As dusk fell, Samuel hitched Kingston to the side of the wagon and headed back to town. He took a circuitous route, avoiding the main street in favor of back alleys. The church was dark when he arrived, but a side door opened as soon as he knocked. Faith stood ready, a small bundle of belongings at her feet and James secured in a sling across her chest. She had changed into a simple traveling dress and sturdy boots. Her hair was pulled back in a practical braid. "Pastor Brown left for his evening rounds," she explained quietly. "He thought it best not to be here when we depart. Fewer questions that way." Samuel nodded, helping gather her things. "The marshal is watching for us. We'll need to be careful leaving town." Faith's expression was resolute. "I know a way. There's a trail behind the church that leads to the old mining road. It's rarely used now." They loaded Faith's meager possessions into the wagon. Samuel noticed she had only one small case of clothing, a few baby items, and a worn book. "Is this everything?" he asked. Faith nodded. "I left with only what I could carry the night I fled. Everything else. Everything from my life before Gerald. It's gone now." The sadness in her voice made Samuel wish he could offer more than just escape. "We'll head north to Fort Collins first. From there, we can decide the best route to Montana Territory." "Have you been to Montana before?" Faith asked as Samuel helped her onto the wagon seat. "Once, years ago," he replied, taking up the reins. "Beautiful country, good place for a fresh start." Faith secured James more snugly against her. "A fresh start," she repeated softly. "I've dreamed of that for so long." Following Faith's directions, Samuel guided the wagon behind the church and onto a narrow trail that wound through scrubby pines, before connecting with an older, less maintained road. The moon provided enough light to navigate, though Samuel kept their pace deliberately slow to avoid unnecessary noise. They had traveled perhaps 2 miles from town when Faith suddenly stiffened beside him. "Listen," she whispered. Samuel reined the horses to a stop, straining to hear what had alarmed her. Then he caught at the distant sound of hoofbeats, more than one horse coming from behind them. "Could be anyone," Samuel said, though he didn't believe it. Faith's face was pale in the moonlight. "It's him." Gerald would never let us simply leave. Samuel made a quick decision. "There's a stand of trees ahead. We'll pull off the road there, wait for them to pass." He guided the wagon into the trees, stopping where the branches provided cover from the road. The sounds of pursuit grew louder. "Stay here," Samuel told Faith, reaching for the rifle John Miller had provided. "Keep low and keep James quiet if you can." Faith nodded, her arms tightening protectively around her son. "Be careful," she whispered. Samuel moved through the trees until he had a clear view of the road. Minutes later, 3 riders appeared, moving at a steady trot. Even in the dim light, Samuel recognized Gerald Wallace at the lead, with the marshal and another man following. They slowed as they approached the area where the wagon had left the road. The marshal dismounted, examining the ground. "Tracks turn off here," he called to Wallace. Wagon went into the trees. Wallace's response was too low for Samuel to hear clearly, but his angry tone carried through the night. The third man, whom Samuel now recognized as one of the men who had stared at him in town, also dismounted, pulling a rifle from his saddle holster. Samuel retreated quietly to the wagon. "3 of them," he told Faith. "Wallace, the marshal, and another man. They've spotted our trail." Fear flashed across Faith's face, but she remained composed. "What do we do?" Samuel considered their options. "We can't outrun them with the wagon, but they don't know these woods, and neither do we." He made a decision. "Grab only what you absolutely need. We'll go on foot, circle back to the road further ahead." Faith moved quickly, gathering a small bundle of baby necessities and food. Samuel unhitched Kingston from the wagon, knowing the faithful gelding would follow without being led. "This way," Samuel whispered, guiding Faith deeper into the trees, away from where the men were searching. They moved as quietly as possible, Faith keeping James close against her chest. The baby, as if sensing the danger, remained blessedly quiet. Behind them, Samuel could hear the men calling to each other as they spread out to search. "Hart," Wallace's voice rang out. "I know you're out there with my wife and child. Show yourself now, and I might let you leave town alive." Samuel exchanged glances with Faith, who shook her head firmly. They continued moving, paralleling the road but staying well within the cover of the trees. They had gone perhaps half a mile when a shot rang out, the bullet splintering bark from a tree near Samuel's head. He pushed Faith down behind a fallen log, drawing his pistol. "Stay here," he ordered, then fired a return shot in the direction of their pursuer, not aiming to hit, but to force the man to take cover. Another shot answered his, closer this time. Samuel fired again, then moved to a different position, hoping to draw fire away from where Faith and James were hidden. The strategy worked. The stranger who had accompanied Wallace and the marshal, moved toward Samuel's new position, rifle ready. Samuel waited until he was close, then stepped out from behind a tree. "That's far enough," he said, his pistol aimed steadily. The man froze, then slowly lowered his rifle. "Wallace just wants his family back," he said. "No need for anyone to get hurt." "The lady made her choice," Samuel replied. "She's not going back." A twig snapped behind Samuel. He started to turn, but too late something struck him hard across the back of the head. Pain exploded through his skull, and the world went dark. Samuel regained consciousness to find himself lying on the ground, his hands bound behind him. Gerald Wallace stood over him, a cruel smile on his face. "Finally awake, I see," Wallace said. "I was beginning to think Jenkins hit you too hard. Would be a shame if you missed what happens next." Samuel tried to sit up, wincing at the pain in his head. "Where is Faith?" "My wife is being escorted back to town by Marshal Briggs," Wallace replied. "Along with my son, where they belong." Anger gave Samuel strength. He managed to get to his knees, glaring up at Wallace. "You'll just continue hurting her. What kind of man beats his wife?" Wallace's expression darkened. The kind who expects obedience in his own home. Faith knew the rules. She chose to break them. The man Wallace had called Jenkins stood nearby, rifle in hand. "What do you want to do with him, Mr. Wallace?" Wallace considered Samuel thoughtfully. "Originally, I planned to have the marshal arrest him for kidnapping, but that would mean a trial, witnesses, messiness." He drew his pistol. "I think we have a simpler solution. A drifter killed while attempting to kidnap a respectable man's wife and child. Tragic, but justice served." Samuel tensed, preparing to lunge despite his bound hands. Before he could move, a shot rang out. For a confused moment, Samuel thought he'd been hit, but it was Jenkins who cried out, dropping his rifle and clutching his shoulder. "Step away from him, Gerald." Faith's voice was steady and clear. Samuel turned to see her standing 20 feet away, the rifle John Miller had given them held confidently in her hands. James was secured in the sling across her chest, still amazingly quiet. Wallace turned slowly. "Faith, this isn't like you. You never knew me," she replied. "Not really." "Now untie him." Wallace's expression hardened. You won't shoot me, not with James right there, not with the father of your child. Faith adjusted her aim slightly. I was raised on a farm, Gerald. I've been shooting since I was 12. I won't kill you, but I promise I won't miss your knee. Something in her voice, absolute certainty, must have convinced Wallace. He hesitated, then slowly bent to untie Samuel's bonds. This changes nothing, Wallace said as he worked. You have nowhere to go, no means to support yourself or the child. You'll be back. No, Faith said simply. We won't. Once Samuel was free, Faith tossed him Jenkins' fallen rifle. The marshal rode ahead with the wagon, she explained. I managed to slip away when Jenkins started tracking you. Samuel rubbed his wrists, impressed by her resourcefulness. Are you all right? Faith nodded. James and I are fine. But we need to move. The marshal will realize I'm gone soon enough. Samuel turned to Wallace and Jenkins, considering their options. We can't leave them here to follow us. There's an old mining shack about half a mile west, Faith said. We can secure them there. It will give us enough time to get away. Despite Wallace's protests and threats, Samuel and Faith marched the two men to the abandoned shack. Using leather straps from Jenkins' saddlebags, they bound both men securely. The marshal will find you by morning, Samuel assured them, checking that the bindings were tight but not cutting off circulation. You might want to reconsider your story about what happened here tonight. Outside, Kingston had faithfully followed their trail. Samuel helped Faith mount, then handed James up to her before swinging up behind them. We'll have to travel light and fast, he said. Are you sure you're up for this? Faith leaned back slightly, her resolve evident in every line of her body. I've never been more sure of anything. They rode through the night, Kingston carrying his triple burden without complaint. By dawn, they had covered nearly 20 miles, staying off the main roads and following game trails when possible. They stopped briefly to rest the horse and feed James, who had begun fussing as the sun rose. Faith handled the baby with practiced ease despite their difficult circumstances. Samuel found himself watching her, admiring her strength and composure. You're good with him, he observed as Faith gently rocked James after feeding him. She smiled, the first true smile Samuel had seen from her. He's the easy part, loving him. That's never been difficult. What will you do when we reach Montana? Samuel asked, offering her a cup of the coffee he'd brewed over their small fire. Faith accepted the cup, her fingers brushing his briefly. I have some skills. I can keep accounts, as the Millers mentioned. I can sew, cook, manage a household. She looked down at James. I'll find a way to provide for us. Samuel nodded, respecting her determination. There are growing towns in the territory, places that might value a woman with your abilities. And you? Faith asked. What awaits you in Montana? Samuel poked at the fire with a stick, considering the question. Not sure, honestly. I've been drifting since the war, taking work where I could find it. Thought I might try for land of my own someday. The war changed you, Faith observed quietly. It wasn't a question, Samuel nodded. Changed everyone who lived through it, I expect. Made some better, some worse. For me, it made me wary of settling, of building something that could be taken away. Faith's gaze was thoughtful. Yet here you are, helping strangers at considerable risk to yourself. Maybe I'm tired of just passing through, Samuel admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of the words. They broke camp soon after, continuing north toward Fort Collins. The day was clear but cool, perfect for traveling. They avoided the few travelers they saw on the roads, unwilling to risk being recognized or remembered. By late afternoon, they reached a small stream where they decided to rest again. Kingston needed the break, and James was becoming fussy. We should reach Fort Collins by tomorrow afternoon if we maintain this pace, Samuel said, helping Faith down from the horse. She winced slightly as her feet touched the ground, and Samuel realized she must be saddle sore from the unaccustomed riding. I'm fine, she assured him, seeing his concern. Just a bit stiff. Samuel unsaddled Kingston and led him to drink from the stream. Faith settled on a fallen log, rocking James gently. You think they're still following us? She asked. Samuel considered the question. Wallace struck me as a man who doesn't give up easily. But we've covered our tracks well, and they don't know which direction we've taken. Faith nodded, her expression troubled. Gerald is persistent, especially when his pride is wounded. Tell me about him, Samuel said, sitting beside her on the log. How did you come to marry him? Faith was quiet for a moment, her eyes on James. I was working for the Millers, as they told you, saving every penny. I had dreams of opening a small shop someday, nothing grand, just a place of my own. She shifted James to her other arm. Gerald began calling at the farm, ostensibly to discuss business with John, but I knew he was watching me. He was handsome, well-spoken, from one of the founding families of Willow Creek. Faith's voice grew softer. He courted me properly, brought gifts, spoke of a future where I would want for nothing. When did you realize the truth about him? Samuel asked. The night after our wedding, Faith replied, her voice steady despite the pain Samuel could see in her eyes. I expressed an opinion that differed from his. He explained that as his wife, my role was to support him in all things, not contradict him. The explanation involved his fists. Samuel felt a surge of anger toward Wallace. And you stayed. I had nowhere to go, Faith said simply. No family, no money of my own anymore, and then I discovered I was carrying James. She looked down at her son, her expression softening. Everything changed when he was born. I knew I couldn't raise a child in that house with that man. I began planning, saving what little I could from the household money. That took courage, Samuel said. Faith shook her head. It took desperation, when Gerald struck me while I was holding James. That was the moment I knew we had to leave, ready or not. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the gentle babbling of the stream and James's occasional coos. We should move on, Samuel finally said. There's a small settlement a few miles ahead where we might find shelter for the night. As they continued their journey, Samuel found himself increasingly aware of Faith's presence behind him on the horse. The trust she placed in him, a virtual stranger, humbled him. For years, he had avoided connections, convinced that attachment only led to loss and pain. Yet here he was, responsible for this woman and her child, and feeling more purposeful than he had in a long time. The settlement Samuel had mentioned turned out to be little more than a trading post with a few rough cabins nearby. The proprietor, a grizzled man named Silas, offered them use of a small lean-to behind his store in exchange for Samuel chopping a cord of wood. Not much, but it's got a roof, Silas said with a shrug. Wife's been dead these 5 years, so don't expect no fancy fixings. The lean-to was indeed basic, a dirt floor, 3 walls, and a sloped roof, but it provided shelter from the night air. Samuel built a small fire while Faith prepared a simple meal from their provisions. James, fed and changed, slept peacefully on a bed Faith made from their spare clothes and blanket. In the firelight, Samuel could see the exhaustion in Faith's face, though she hadn't complained once during their difficult journey. You should rest, he told her, offering his blanket. I'll keep watch. Faith accepted the blanket with a grateful smile. You need rest too, Samuel, we both do. I'll sleep later, he promised. Army habit never could sleep well the first night in a new place anyway. Faith settled beside James, arranging the blanket over both of them. Tell me about your home, before the war. Samuel poked at the fire, watching the sparks rise into the night sky. Farm in Pennsylvania, not large but productive. My father grew wheat and corn, kept a few dairy cows. Mother made the best apple pie in the county. Do they still live there? Faith asked softly. Samuel shook his head. Father died while I was fighting at Antietam. Mother held on until I came home, then followed him a few months later. Grief, the doctor said. I'm sorry, Faith said, and Samuel could hear the genuine sympathy in her voice. I sold the farm, he continued. Couldn't bear to work the land without them. Used the money to buy Kingston and head west. Been moving ever since. Looking for something, Faith observed. Samuel glanced at her. Or running from something, never quite decided which. Faith's eyes were starting to close, her exhaustion winning out over her desire to talk. Perhaps both, she murmured. Samuel watched as she drifted to sleep, her face relaxing in a way he hadn't seen before. With the worry and fear temporarily banished by slumber, she looked younger, almost peaceful. James slept beside her, one tiny hand escaped from his blanket. For the first time in years, Samuel allowed himself to imagine a different kind of future, one with purpose beyond mere survival, one with connections to other people. It was a dangerous line of thinking, he knew. Faith needed his help to escape Wallace and establish herself somewhere safe. She wasn't looking for more complications in her life, and neither was he. Yet as the night deepened around them, Samuel found the idea taking root in his mind. What if, after all his wandering, he had finally found a reason to stop? Morning brought a clear sky and renewed determination to reach Fort Collins. After a quick breakfast and a fair trade with Sila's for additional supplies, they set out again, Kingston seemingly refreshed by the night's rest. The landscape began to change as they traveled, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills with the distant promise of mountains on the horizon. They made good time, encountering few other travelers. By mid-afternoon, the town of Fort Collins came into view larger than Willow Creek, with proper streets and substantial buildings that spoke of prosperity and permanence. "We should be careful," Samuel cautioned as they approached. "Wallace might have telegraphed ahead." Faith nodded, adjusting her bonnet to better shield her face. "Where should we go?" Samuel considered their options. "We need proper rest for us and for Kingston. I know a place on the edge of town, a widow who takes in lodgers. She doesn't ask many questions. Mrs. Abigail Thompson proved to be exactly as Samuel remembered, practical, discreet, and uninterested in her lodgers' histories. She offered them a small but clean room at the back of her house, with a separate entrance that appealed to Samuel's caution. "Extra for the baby, Mrs. Thompson said matter-of-factly. "He cries, you deal with it quick. Other lodgers don't complain, I don't complain." "That's fair," Faith agreed, handing over the money Samuel had given her. She had initially protested using his funds, but he had insisted. "I've been saving for years," he told her. "Never found much worth spending on, until now." The room contained a narrow bed, a small table with a basin and pitcher, and a rocking chair that had seen better days but was still serviceable. Samuel immediately offered Faith the bed. "I'll sleep on the floor," he said, unrolling his bedroll. "Been sleeping on hard ground for years anyway." Faith looked as if she might protest, then nodded gratefully. "Just for tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out something else." Samuel brought in their few belongings while Faith settled James. The baby had been remarkably good-natured throughout their journey, but was now fussing, perhaps sensing his mother's exhaustion and worry. "I can hold him while you rest," Samuel offered, seeing Faith struggling to soothe the increasingly cranky infant. Faith hesitated only briefly before carefully transferring James to Samuel's arms. "Support his head," she instructed, though Samuel was already doing so. It had been many years since Samuel had held a baby, not since his cousin's children before the war, but the instinct came back naturally. He cradled James against his chest, one large hand supporting the baby's head, and began a gentle rocking motion. "You've done this before," Faith observed, watching them with a tired smile. "Long time ago," Samuel admitted. "My aunt had twins. I used to help when I visited." James quieted in Samuel's arms, his big eyes the same green as Faith, studying Samuel's face with what seemed like solemn consideration. "He likes you," Faith said, the surprise evident in her voice. Samuel smiled down at the baby. "Smart fellow. Already knows who's on his side." Faith watched them for a moment longer, then yielded to her exhaustion, stretching out on the bed. "Wake me if he needs feeding," she murmured, her eyes already closing. "We'll be fine," Samuel assured her. "Get some rest." As Faith slept, Samuel settled in the rocking chair with James. The baby remained calm, occasionally making soft cooing sounds or grasping at Samuel's finger with his tiny hand. "You and your mama are something special," Samuel whispered to the child. "Brave, both of you, braver than most men I've known." James blinked solemnly, as if considering this assessment. "I'm going to make sure you both get somewhere safe," Samuel continued, his voice low so as not to wake Faith. "Somewhere you can grow up strong and free without fear." It was a promise Samuel intended to keep, though he wasn't yet certain how. Fort Collins was larger than Willow Creek, but not so large that strangers wouldn't be noticed. If Wallace had indeed telegraphed ahead, they would need to move on quickly. Montana Territory was still the logical destination, far enough to make pursuit difficult, new enough that people asked fewer questions about one's past. But the journey would be challenging, especially with a baby. They would need more supplies, perhaps a wagon of their own. All of this would require money more than Samuel currently possessed. He would need to find work, at least temporarily. As James finally drifted to sleep in his arms, Samuel made his decision. They would stay in Fort Collins just long enough to earn money for the journey north. A week, perhaps 2. Then they would leave before Wallace could track them down. Faith slept deeply for several hours, waking only when James began to fuss with hunger. She sat up quickly, momentarily disoriented. "We're safe," Samuel assured her, bringing James to her. "Mrs. Thompson brought some food while you were sleeping. It's on the table there." Faith took James, adjusting her clothing to feed him. Samuel respectfully turned away, giving her privacy. "Thank you for watching him," Faith said. "I can't remember the last time I slept so soundly." "He's a good boy," Samuel replied, focusing on arranging the food. Mrs. Thompson had provided a hearty stew, bread, and some preserved fruit. Hardly made a peep. Once James was fed and settled, Faith joined Samuel at the small table. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, both appreciating the simple but satisfying meal. "I've been thinking," Samuel said finally. "We'll need more money for the journey to Montana. I should look for work here just for a week or so." Faith nodded. "I can work too, Mrs. Thompson might know of something suitable." "Are you sure?" Samuel asked. "It might be safer for you to stay out of sight as much as possible." "I can't ask you to carry this burden alone," Faith said firmly. "You've already done more than anyone could expect. Besides, I'm not afraid of work." Samuel recognized the determination in her voice and knew better than to argue. "We'll ask Mrs. Thompson in the morning then. For now, we both need rest." That night, as Samuel lay on his bedroll on the floor, listening to Faith's and James's soft breathing from the bed, he realized how quickly they had become important to him. What had begun as a simple act of assistance had somehow evolved into something more: a commitment, a shared journey, perhaps even the beginnings of a new kind of life. The thought should have frightened him. Instead, he found it brought a peace he hadn't felt in years. The next morning, Mrs. Thompson proved helpful in their search for work. She needed someone to help with laundry and cleaning, tasks Faith readily agreed to take on. For Samuel, she suggested the lumber mill at the edge of town. "They're always looking for strong backs," Mrs. Thompson said over breakfast. "Pay is fair and they don't ask too many questions." Samuel found this to be true. The foreman at the lumber mill hired him on the spot, impressed by his height and obvious strength. The work was hard loading cut timber onto wagons for transport, but the pay was indeed fair. Over the next week, they fell into a routine. Samuel worked from dawn until late afternoon at the mill, while Faith helped Mrs. Thompson with household tasks, James either sleeping nearby or secured in a makeshift sling. In the evenings, they would eat together in their room, planning their journey north in quiet conversations. Faith proved to be not only resilient but resourceful. She managed to stretch their money further than Samuel would have thought possible, and even began taking in mending from other lodgers to earn extra coins. Samuel found himself admiring her more each day: her intelligence, her gentle strength, the unwavering love she showed her son. Despite all she had endured, there was no bitterness in her, only a determination to build a better future. For his part, Samuel discovered he enjoyed having people to come back to at the end of a day's work. The simple pleasure of seeing Faith smile when he entered their room, of holding James while Faith prepared their evening meal, these things brought a contentment he had almost forgotten was possible. On the 8th day of their stay in Fort Collins, everything changed. Samuel was returning from the lumber mill, his pay for the week secure in his pocket, when he noticed a poster tacked to the wall of the general store. His steps slowed, then stopped altogether as he read the bold text: "Reward offered for information leading to the recovery of Faith Wallace and infant son James taken by force from their home by Samuel Hart." A dangerous drifter $100 reward below the text was a reasonably accurate description of both Samuel and Faith. Samuel quickly tore down the poster, but his mind was racing. If this poster had reached Fort Collins, others would follow. Their time had run out. He hurried back to Mrs. Thompson's house, taking a circuitous route and checking frequently to ensure he wasn't followed. Faith was in their room, folding laundry while James played on a blanket on the floor. "We need to leave," Samuel said without preamble, showing her the poster. "Tonight, Faith's face paled as she read it. "He's claiming you kidnapped us and offering enough money to tempt anyone who recognizes us," Samuel added grimly. "I've been paid for the week. We should have enough to get supplies and start north immediately." Faith nodded, already moving to gather their belongings. "Mrs. Thompson, I'll speak with her," Samuel assured her. "She's been kind to us. I think she'll understand." Mrs. Thompson did indeed understand, though she warned them that others might not be so sympathetic. "That's a lot of money for folks around here," she said, accepting the extra Samuel offered for their hasty departure. "You'd best be careful who you trust from here on out." They purchased supplies as discreetly as possible, food that would keep, extra blankets, and a small tent. Samuel also invested in a used wagon and team from a farmer heading back east. It cost most of their savings, but would make the journey north much more manageable, especially with James. They left Fort Collins as dusk was falling, taking the less traveled western road that would eventually lead them to the mountain passes and into Montana territory. Samuel drove the wagon with Faith beside him holding James. Kingston was tethered behind, occasionally nickering softly as if questioning this change in plans. "Are you certain about this?" Faith asked once they were several miles from town. "The poster named you specifically." "You could leave us somewhere safe, go your own way. Draw Gerald's attention from us." Samuel shook his head firmly. "I'm not leaving you and James to fend for yourselves. We started this journey together, we'll finish it together." Faith was silent for a moment, then reached over to cover his hand with hers. "Thank you," she said simply. The touch of her hand sent warmth through Samuel that had nothing to do with the mild spring evening. He turned his palm up, briefly clasping her fingers before returning his attention to the road. They traveled through the night, stopping only when necessary to rest the horses and tend to James's needs. By dawn, they had covered nearly 20 miles, and Samuel felt confident enough to make camp by a small stream. As Faith prepared a simple breakfast, Samuel checked the horses and secured the camp. The land was opening up before them, vast and promising, with the mountains now clearly visible to the west. "We'll follow this valley north," Samuel explained over breakfast, sketching a rough map in the dirt. "There's a pass through the mountains that should be passable this time of year. Once we're through, we'll be in Montana territory." Faith studied his improvised map. "How long will the journey take?" 2 weeks, maybe 3, depending on the weather and the condition of the trails, Samuel estimated. "The pass can be tricky if there's late snow." Faith nodded, her expression determined. "We'll manage." The confidence in her voice warmed Samuel. In the short time he had known her, Faith had proven herself to be far stronger than her delicate appearance suggested. They broke camp after breakfast and continued north. The day was clear and mild, perfect for traveling. The road, such as it was, followed the meandering course of the stream, occasionally crossing it at shallow fords. By mid-afternoon, they had reached a small trading post, little more than a crude cabin with a corral for horses. The proprietor, a weathered man with a wild beard, eyed them suspiciously as they approached. "Just passing through," Samuel explained, keeping his tone friendly but not inviting further conversation. "Looking to water the horses and perhaps trade for some fresh food." The man grunted, jerking his head toward a water trough. "Help yourself. Got some dried venison and beans inside if you're interested." While Samuel tended to the horses, Faith remained in the wagon with James. Samuel noticed her pull her shawl more closely around her face, obscuring her features. Inside the trading post, Samuel selected a few items, keeping his interaction with the proprietor brief. As he was paying, he noticed a folded paper on the counter, another reward poster, identical to the one he had seen in Fort Collins. "Seen anyone matching these descriptions?" The proprietor asked, following Samuel's gaze to the poster. Samuel shook his head. "Can't say that I have." "When did that come through?" "Ryder brought it yesterday," the man replied. "Said there might be more reward coming for anyone who actually captures them." "Seems this Hart fellow is wanted for other crimes too." Samuel maintained a neutral expression. "What kind of crimes?" The proprietor shrugged. "Didn't say specifics, just that he's dangerous. You heading north, south?" Samuel lied smoothly. "Looking for work in Denver." The man seemed to lose interest, counting the coins Samuel had placed on the counter. Safe travels, then. Samuel returned to the wagon, handing Faith the supplies before climbing onto the seat beside her. We need to keep moving, he said quietly. The reward posters are spreading, and Wallace is adding claims that I'm wanted for other crimes. Faith's eyes widened. What crimes? Doesn't matter, Samuel replied, urging the horses forward. It's a lie designed to make it more likely someone will try to stop us. They traveled until well after dark, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the trading post. When they finally made camp in a sheltered hollow, Samuel built only a small fire, wary of the light being visible from a distance. Will they follow us all the way to Montana? Faith asked as they sat close to the fire, James sleeping peacefully in her arms. Samuel considered the question. Wallace is determined, but even he has limits. The further north we go, the harder it will be for him to maintain the search. Faith nodded, though she didn't look entirely convinced. What happens when we reach Montana? We can't keep running forever. It was a question Samuel had been asking himself. Montana territory is still developing. New towns, new people arriving all the time. It would be easy to establish ourselves with different names, create a new history. A fresh start, Faith murmured, echoing her words from days earlier. Yes, Samuel agreed, for all of us. Faith looked up at him, her expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. You say us as if you plan to stay with us. Samuel hadn't intended to broach this subject yet, but now that it was raised, he found he couldn't dissemble. If that would be welcome, he said carefully. I've been thinking about it, about what might come after we reach Montana. Faith was silent for a moment, her gaze returning to the fire. I never expected to trust a man again, she finally said. After Gerald, I thought that part of me was broken forever. Faith, Samuel began, but she continued. But you've shown me that not all men are like him. You've risked everything for James and me, asking nothing in return. She looked up at him again, and this time Samuel could see the emotion in her eyes. Whatever happens in Montana, I will always be grateful for that gift. Samuel moved closer, hesitantly reaching out to touch her cheek. I'm not looking for gratitude, Faith. She leaned slightly into his touch. What are you looking for, Samuel Hart? The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. Samuel had never been a man of many words, had always found it difficult to express the deeper workings of his heart. But Faith deserved honesty. A place to belong, he said simply. People to belong to. I've been wandering since the war, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. But these past weeks with you and James, for the first time in years, I felt like I might have found a reason to stop running. Faith's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. We come with complications. A past that's following us, a future that's uncertain. I've never been afraid of complications, Samuel replied with a small smile. Just of caring too much about something that might be lost. Faith shifted James to one arm, her other hand reaching for Samuel's. And now, Samuel interlaced his fingers with hers. Now I think some things are worth the risk. In the days that followed, they continued their journey north, each mile bringing them closer to Montana territory and further from Wallace's reach. The terrain grew more challenging as they approached the mountain pass, but the weather remained favorable, allowing steady progress. Their relationship evolved as they traveled, small touches, shared smiles, quiet conversations by the fire after James was asleep. There was no formal declaration between them, no dramatic moment of revelation. Instead, there was a gradual, natural deepening of connection, a recognition of what was growing between them. Samuel found himself sharing stories from before the war, memories he had kept locked away for years. Faith spoke of her childhood on a small farm, of parents lost to fever when she was 16, of dreams she had set aside but never forgotten. I always wanted a small store, she confessed one evening. Not just any store, but one with books and paper and pens, things that were hard to come by where I grew up. Why not in Montana? Samuel suggested. New settlements need such things. People want more than just the basics once they're established. Faith's eyes brightened at the idea. Do you think it would be possible? I think you can make it possible, Samuel replied. You have the determination and the skill. James, too, seemed to thrive on the journey despite its challenges. He grew stronger each day, his curious eyes taking in the changing landscape, his small hands reaching for Samuel whenever he was near. He's becoming attached to you, Faith observed one afternoon as Samuel held James while she prepared their meal. Samuel looked down at the baby, who was contentedly playing with one of his shirt buttons. The feeling is mutual, he admitted. They were a day's journey from the mountain pass when they encountered the first real obstacle of their journey. The trail narrowed as it wound alongside a swollen creek, the recent spring rains having turned what should have been an easy crossing into a dangerous challenge. Samuel stopped the wagon, studying the rushing water with concern. We'll need to find another way across, he decided. This is too risky, Faith nodded, looking up at the darkening sky. There's a storm coming. We should find shelter. They backtracked to a small clearing they had passed earlier, making camp beneath a stand of pines that would provide some protection from the impending rain. Samuel had just finished securing the horses when the first heavy drops began to fall. They huddled in the wagon as the storm intensified, thunder rolling across the valley. James, startled by the noise, began to cry. Faith rocked him, singing softly to calm him. Samuel watched them, struck again by the fierce protectiveness he felt toward both mother and child. In the few weeks since he had first seen Faith on the church steps in Willow Creek, they had become more important to him than anything had been in years. The storm continued through the night, rain giving way to a heavy, wet snow that blanketed the ground by morning. Samuel awoke to find Faith already up. James bundled warmly against her as she heated coffee over the small stove they had brought from Fort Collins. The pass will be difficult now, Samuel said, accepting the cup she offered him. Snow this late in spring usually melts quickly, but it will make the trail slippery for a day or two. Faith's expression was resolute. We'll manage. We've come too far to turn back now. Her determination bolstered Samuel's confidence. Together, they prepared to continue their journey, packing the wagon carefully and checking the horses' harnesses. They had just started toward the creek crossing when Samuel spotted movement on the trail behind them. Riders, 3 of them, moving at a steady pace in their direction. Get in the wagon, Samuel told Faith urgently. Stay down and keep James quiet if you can. Faith didn't waste time with questions, quickly climbing into the wagon bed and covering herself and James with blankets. Samuel took the reins, urging the horses forward at a faster pace, hoping to reach the creek crossing before the riders caught up. But the muddy trail slowed their progress, and the riders were gaining. Samuel considered their options. They could try to outrun their pursuers, but the wagon wasn't built for speed. They could stand and fight, but if these were bounty hunters after the reward, they would be armed and determined. The decision was made for him when one of the riders called out, "Hart, stop the wagon." Samuel recognized the voice immediately. Gerald Wallace. Somehow, he had tracked them all the way from Willow Creek. With no time to reach the creek crossing, Samuel guided the wagon off the trail into a small clearing surrounded by pines. He quickly grabbed the rifle and his pistol, then moved to the back of the wagon where Faith was already sitting up. James clutched tightly to her chest. "It's Wallace," Samuel told her quietly, "with 2 others, probably hired guns." Fear flashed across Faith's face, but she nodded, her jaw set with determination. "What do we do?" Samuel helped her from the wagon. "Get behind those rocks," he said, indicating a large boulder at the edge of the clearing. "I'll try to reason with them first, but if that fails." Faith touched his arm. "Be careful, Samuel. Gerald isn't a reasonable man when his pride is at stake." Samuel nodded, squeezing her hand briefly before turning to face the approaching riders. Wallace was in the lead, flanked by 2 rough-looking men Samuel didn't recognize. All 3 carried rifles. "That's far enough," Samuel called when they were about 20 yards away. He held his rifle ready but not aimed directly at them. The 3 men reined their horses to a stop. Wallace's face was a mask of cold fury as he surveyed the scene. "Where is my wife?" he demanded. "Where is my son?" "They're safe," Samuel replied evenly. "And they're not going back with you, Wallace. Faith has made her choice." Wallace's laugh was harsh. "Choice? A woman doesn't choose to leave her husband, especially not a woman with nowhere to go, no means to support herself." "She has me," Samuel said simply. Wallace's eyes narrowed. "Yes, she does, doesn't she? Tell me, Hart, how long did it take you to seduce my wife? Was that your plan from the beginning, to steal another man's family?" Samuel kept his voice steady, despite the anger rising in him. No one stole anything. Faith left because of how you treated her, because she feared for her safety and that of your son. Lies, Wallace spat. She was well provided for, had everything a woman could want. Except freedom from fear, Faith's voice came from behind Samuel. She had emerged from her hiding place, though she kept James shielded in her arms. Accept the right to speak without being struck. Accept dignity and respect. Wallace's expression darkened further at the sight of her. You've forgotten your place, Faith, but I'm willing to be merciful. Come back now and I'll forgive this. Lapse in judgment. Faith moved to stand beside Samuel. I'm not coming back, Gerald, not ever. I've found a better life for myself and for James. With him, Wallace gestured contemptuously at Samuel, a drifter with nothing to his name. How long before he tires of you and the child, before he moves on as men like him always do? Samuel felt Faith's hand slip into his, a silent statement of trust that meant more than any words could have. You don't know him, Faith said, her voice steady. Just as you never truly knew me. Wallace's control seemed to snap. He raised his rifle, aiming it at Samuel. I won't ask again. Get away from my wife and child. Samuel pushed Faith behind him, his own rifle ready. Lower your weapon, Wallace. This doesn't need to end in bloodshed. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then one of Wallace's companions, a man with a scar across his cheek, spoke up. This ain't worth dying over, Wallace. You said we'd collect a reward, not get into a shooting match. Shut up, Wallace snapped, but the man was already backing his horse away. He's right, the other hired gun said. You didn't mention the fellow would be armed and waiting. I ain't getting killed over your family squabble. Wallace's face contorted with rage as both men turned their horses and rode back the way they had come, leaving him alone facing Samuel and Faith. Cowards. Wallace shouted after them, then returned his attention to Samuel and Faith. It doesn't matter. I don't need them to reclaim what's mine. It's over, Gerald, Faith said, her voice surprisingly gentle. Go home. Begin a new life as we are doing. It's not over until I say it's over, Wallace replied, his finger tightening on the trigger of his rifle. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Wallace fired, the shot going wide as Samuel pushed Faith further behind him. Samuel returned fire, his bullet striking Wallace in the shoulder, causing him to drop his weapon and fall from his horse. Wallace hit the ground hard, crying out in pain. Samuel approached cautiously, keeping his rifle trained on the wounded man. It's finished, Samuel said firmly. You've lost. Wallace glared up at him, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Kill me then, finish it. Samuel shook his head. I'm not a murderer. You're going to get on your horse and ride back to Willow Creek, and you're going to forget about Faith and James. Or what? Wallace sneered. Or next time I won't aim for your shoulder, Samuel replied, his voice hard. And I'll make sure everyone knows exactly why Faith fled, what kind of man you really are behind the respectable facade. Something in Samuel's tone must have convinced Wallace of his seriousness. The wounded man struggled to his feet, his face pale with pain and rage. Help him onto his horse, Samuel told Faith. We'll bind his wound first. Faith hesitated, then handed James to Samuel and moved to assist her former husband. With efficient movements, she tore strips from a spare cloth and bound Wallace's shoulder tightly enough to slow the bleeding. Why are you helping me? Wallace asked as she worked, his voice low and confused. Because unlike you, I don't find satisfaction in causing pain, Faith replied simply. Once Wallace was mounted, Samuel handed him the reins. Remember what I said, this ends here. Wallace looked down at them, his expression unreadable. You think you've won, but life in these territories is harsh. What will you do when winter comes? When the child is sick and there's no doctor for miles. When you're struggling to put food on the table, we'll manage, Faith said, taking James back from Samuel. Together, Wallace's laugh was bitter. Together, we'll see how long that lasts. With a final glare, he turned his horse and rode away, hunched in the saddle from his injury. They watched until he disappeared from view, the tension slowly draining from Samuel's body as the immediate danger passed. Do you think he'll come back? Faith asked, leaning against Samuel's side. Samuel put his arm around her shoulders. Not any time soon, and by then we'll be established somewhere new, somewhere he can't find us easily. Faith looked up at him, her expression serious. You shot him. Had to, Samuel said simply. He would have killed me otherwise and then taken you and James. Faith nodded, accepting this truth. Thank you for everything. Samuel drew her closer. No need for thanks between us, Faith, not anymore. They returned to the wagon, both aware that a significant chapter had closed. Wallace might not have truly accepted his defeat, but he was injured, alone, and a long way from home. The immediate threat had passed. Now they could look forward, to the past that would lead them into Montana territory, to the future they were building together. The mountain pass proved challenging but not impossible. The late spring snow melted quickly under the warm sun, leaving the trail muddy but passable. They took their time, Samuel carefully guiding the wagon around the steepest sections, Faith walking alongside when the grade became too difficult for the horses to pull their full weight. 3 days after their confrontation with Wallace, they crested the final rise and looked down into the vast expanse of Montana territory. Rolling hills gave way to open plains, with mountains visible in the distance. The land seemed to stretch endlessly before them, wild and beautiful and full of promise. It's magnificent, Faith breathed, holding James up so he could see, though the baby was more interested in grabbing at a butterfly that had landed on the wagon seat. Samuel nodded, taking in the view with a sense of possibility he hadn't felt in years. New beginnings, he said, for all of us. They made camp that night on the Montana side of the pass, celebrating their arrival with a special meal from their dwindling supplies. As James slept peacefully in his makeshift cradle, Samuel and Faith sat by the fire discussing their plans. There's a settlement about 2 days' journey from here, Samuel said. Helena, its growing fast gold was discovered nearby a few years back, might be a good place to start. Faith nodded, considering. Would there be need for a store like I described, with books and writing supplies? I'd imagine so, Samuel replied. Places like that attract all sorts miners and ranchers, but also people looking to build businesses, start schools, establish churches. They'd need the things you want to sell. Faith's expression grew thoughtful. And what about you? What would you do in Helena? Samuel had been considering this question himself. I have skills with horses, with building. I could find work easily enough to start, eventually. He hesitated, then continued. Eventually, I'd like land of my own, not a large spread, but enough for a decent home, some horses, maybe a few cattle. That sounds wonderful, Faith said softly. A real home. Samuel reached for her hand. Faith, I want to be clear about something. I didn't help you and James escape just to expect anything in return. If you want to make your own way in Helena, I'll understand. Faith's fingers tightened around his. Is that what you think I want, to make my own way separate from you? Samuel met her gaze steadily. I think you deserve the chance to choose freely, without feeling obligated by what's happened between us. Faith moved closer, her free hand coming up to touch his face. Samuel Hart, you are the most honorable, frustrating man I've ever known. Her eyes were warm with affection and something deeper. Do you think I don't know my own mind, my own heart? Samuel covered her hand with his own. I think you've had precious little chance to discover either, given what you've endured. Then let me be perfectly clear, Faith said, her voice soft but determined. I choose you, not out of obligation or gratitude, but because in you I've found something I never thought to find again: trust, hope, the possibility of love. The word hung between them, new and fragile but undeniable. Samuel drew her closer, his hand gentle on her waist. I never expected to find you, he confessed. I wasn't looking for this, for someone to care about, to build a life with. And now, Faith asked, her face tilted up to his. Now I can't imagine any other path, Samuel replied. You and James. You've become my home, Faith. Wherever we go, whatever we build in Helena or beyond home is with you. Faith's smile was radiant. Then kiss me, Samuel Hart. Kiss me like a man who's found his way home. Samuel did, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that held all the promise of their future tender at first, then deepening with the emotion they had both kept carefully contained until now. Faith's arms slipped around his neck, her body fitting perfectly against his, as if they had been designed as two halves of a whole. When they finally parted, both breathless, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said simply. I think I have since I first saw you on those church steps, though I was too stubborn to admit it even to myself. Faith's laugh was soft and joyful. And I love you. For your courage, your kindness, your strength. For the way you look at James as if he were your own son. He could be, Samuel said, the words coming before he had fully formed the thought. If you would do me the honor of becoming my wife, Faith, I would raise James as my own, love him as my own. Faith's eyes filled with tears. Are you asking me to marry you, Samuel Hart? Samuel smiled, suddenly certain. I believe I am. Not right away, we should establish ourselves in Helena first, build something stable. But yes, I'm asking you to be my wife. To make this journey, we've started a lifelong one. Faith's answer was another kiss, this one filled with such happiness that Samuel felt it might overflow from his very soul. They arrived in Helena 2 days later, the growing settlement sprawling along the base of a range of hills. It was larger than Samuel had expected, a proper town with wooden sidewalks, substantial buildings, and the unmistakable energy of a place on the rise. They found lodging at a modest boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Carpenter, who cooed over James and showed them to a small but clean room with a separate alcove for the baby. Plenty of opportunity here for folks willing to work, she told them over supper that evening. Towns growing every day need all sorts of skills. Over the next few weeks, Samuel and Faith established themselves in Helena. Samuel found work with a builder who was constructing new homes for the influx of settlers. The pay was good, and the builder, a straightforward man named Thompson, seemed impressed with Samuel's carpentry skills. Faith, meanwhile, began making inquiries about available storefronts and suppliers who might provide the books and stationery she hoped to sell. To their surprise, there was indeed no dedicated bookshop in Helena, though the general store carried a limited selection. There's a small space for rent on Cedar Street, Faith told Samuel one evening, excitement brightening her eyes. It would need some work, but the location is good near the school they're building. Samuel smiled at her enthusiasm. We should look at it together tomorrow. If it's suitable, I can help with the repairs. They had been in Helena for a month when Faith received a letter forwarded from the Millers in Colorado. It was from Martha Miller, containing news that made Faith's hands tremble as she read. What is it? Samuel asked, concern evident in his voice. Faith looked up, her expression a mixture of relief and disbelief. It's Gerald, he's dead. Samuel took the letter she held out, reading Martha's careful handwriting. According to the news that had reached Willow Creek, Gerald Wallace had been found dead in his home, apparently from infection of the shoulder wound he had received during their confrontation. He had refused proper medical treatment, perhaps out of pride or fear of questions about how he had been injured. I don't know what to feel, Faith admitted, sitting heavily on their small bed. I never wished him dead, despite everything. Samuel sat beside her, taking her hand. Of course you didn't. You're not made that way. Faith leaned against him. It means we're truly free now. He can't come after us, can't try to take James. Samuel nodded, understanding the complex emotions this news must be stirring in her. What do you want to do now? Faith was quiet for a moment, then straightened. I want to move forward, to build the life we've been planning, the shop, the home we've talked about. She looked up at him. I don't want to wait any longer to be your wife, Samuel. 2 weeks later, on a clear autumn day, Samuel Hart and Faith Calloway were married in the newly completed church in Helena. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, attended by the friends they had already made in their short time in the town, Mrs. Carpenter held James during the service, the baby dressed in a new outfit Faith had sewn for the occasion. Thompson, Samuel's employer, stood as witness, along with the young schoolteacher who had become Faith's friend and first customer for the books she had begun to stock in her small shop. As they exchanged vows, Samuel looked into Faith's eyes and saw their whole journey reflected there, from that first desperate meeting on the church steps in Willow Creek to this moment of commitment and hope. Faith's answering smile was radiant, full of the same love and trust that had brought them through danger and uncertainty to this new beginning. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the pastor declared. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. When Samuel kissed his bride, It was with the certainty that some journeys were meant to last a lifetime. 5 years later, Samuel stood on the porch of their home outside Helena, watching as Faith moved among the flower beds she had planted. James at her side carefully carrying a watering can almost too big for his 6-year-old hands. Beside them toddled 3-year-old Sarah, named for Samuel's mother, her dark curls bouncing as she tried to help by pulling up the occasional weed. The house was everything Samuel had dreamed of, sturdy and welcoming, built largely by his own hands on the 20 acres of land they had purchased 2 years after arriving in Helena. There was a good barn for the horses, including Kingston, now enjoying a well-deserved semi-retirement, and the small herd of cattle that provided both milk and meat. Faith's bookshop in town had flourished, becoming a gathering place for the community and a source of particular pride for both of them. Samuel managed their land and continued to work with Thompson on building projects in the growing town, his reputation for quality craftsmanship bringing steady work. As he watched his family in the garden, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a chance encounter on church steps to this life they had built together, it seemed both improbable and inevitable, as if they had always been meant to find each other. Faith looked up, catching his eye with a smile that still made his heart skip a beat. She said something to James, who nodded seriously before taking his sister's hand and leading her toward the porch. "Papa," Sarah called, breaking free from her brother to run to Samuel. "I helped with the flowers." Samuel scooped her up, laughing at the dirt smudged across her chubby cheeks. "I can see that, little one. You've been working very hard." James reached the porch at a more dignified pace, his green eyes so like Faith serious. "Mother says to tell you supper will be ready soon. She's just finishing in the garden." Samuel ruffled the boy's hair affectionately. "Thank you, James. Why don't you help Sarah wash up while I go see if your mother needs anything?" As the children went inside, Samuel crossed the yard to where Faith was gathering the last of the day's vegetables. She straightened as he approached, her smile warming. "You were looking very thoughtful on the porch," she observed, accepting the kiss he offered. Samuel nodded, taking the basket of vegetables from her. "Just thinking about how far we've come, how much has changed since that day in Willow Creek." Faith slipped her arm through his as they walked back toward the house. "For the better, I hope." Samuel stopped, turning to face her fully. The years had only enhanced her beauty, adding a quiet confidence that shone from within. The fear and uncertainty that had marked her face when they first met were long gone, replaced by the contentment of a woman who knew she was deeply loved. "For the better in every way," he assured her. "I found more than I ever dreamed possible that day. I found my way home." Faith stood on tiptoe to kiss him again, her lips soft against his. "As did I, Samuel Hart, as did I." Together they walked toward the house where their children waited, toward the life they had built from courage and hope and love, a life that had begun when a weary drifter rode into town looking for feed, and found instead his heart's true destination.